The Senate chamber was tense that evening, cameras flashing as John Kennedy leaned forward, ready to pounce. Vice President Kamala Harris had taken her seat to deliver a sharp response to a series of legal questions, but Kennedy seemed more interested in cutting her off than hearing her words. The first interruption came almost immediately. Harris began outlining her point, only for Kennedy to raise his voice, forcing her to pause. She smiled politely, refusing to lose her composure. The second interruption was louder, sharper, as though Kennedy believed repetition alone could derail her. Harris tilted her head, let him finish, and then calmly returned to her sentence exactly where she had left off, drawing chuckles from the gallery. By the third and fourth interruptions, it became clear to everyone watching that Kennedy wasn't debating, he was trying to dominate. Harris leaned back, folded her hands, and simply waited. The silence stretched until Kennedy had no choice but to stop. Then she resumed, unshaken. The fifth and sixth interruptions grew increasingly desperate. Kennedy cut her off mid-sentence, his tone frustrated. Harris, however, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she met his gaze with calm authority, letting the chamber, and the viewers at home, see who was truly in control. Then came the seventh moment. Kennedy tried once again to silence her, but Harris finally leaned forward, her voice steady yet piercing. "Senator," she said, "if you would allow me to complete a single thought without interruption, perhaps you wouldn't feel the need to repeat yourself 6 times. The American people deserve answers, not noise." The chamber erupted. Some senators hid their smiles while others nodded in agreement. Kennedy, for the first time that evening, fell silent. Harris carried on, her words uninterrupted, her authority unquestioned. By the end of the exchange, clips of the confrontation were already circulating online. Viewers praised Harris for her composure and sharp delivery. Kennedy's interruptions had backfired, leaving him looking flustered while Harris appeared unshakable. What was meant to be his moment of control ended with her decisive victory, sealed in just one final line. The chamber grew louder as whispers rippled across the room. Kennedy leaned back slightly, his expression tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not in front of the cameras. Kamala Harris, however, stayed calm. She adjusted the microphone, her voice steady as she picked up her argument right where she had been interrupted. Every word carried clarity, and the more she spoke, the more the senators and audience realized she had complete control. Kennedy tried to recover his momentum. He cleared his throat, preparing another sharp interjection. But this time, Harris anticipated it. She raised her hand slightly and said, "Senator, I promise I'll yield when I'm finished. But interruptions won't erase the facts." The gallery reacted with murmurs, some even clapping softly before being hushed. Kennedy's face reddened, but he was stuck. If he interrupted again, he risked looking even more desperate. If he stayed silent, Harris would dominate the floor. For the first time in the exchange, Kennedy hesitated. Kamala Harris seized the silence like a seasoned prosecutor walking into a courtroom. She leaned forward, her tone sharpened, and the chamber fell quiet to catch every word. "Here is what the American people need to know," she began, emphasizing each phrase with precision. "The constant interruptions don't change the facts. What matters is accountability, clarity, and truth." Kennedy shifted in his chair, his arms folding across his chest. He muttered something under his breath, but the microphones caught none of it. The cameras, however, caught everything, the tightened jaw, the restless eyes, the clear frustration. Harris continued without pause. She cited dates, documented evidence, and previous statements Kennedy himself had made on the same issue. Each point was like a nail in the coffin of his argument, delivered calmly and methodically. By the time she finished her sentence, the chamber was buzzing again. Senators who had been silent began whispering to one another, impressed by her composure under pressure. Kennedy looked as though he had swung wildly only to watch his opponent stand taller, untouched. Kennedy leaned forward again, refusing to let the moment slip away. His voice rose, sharp and cutting, as he interjected for the fourth time. "That's not what the record shows," he barked, waving a stack of papers in his hand. But Harris didn't flinch. Instead, she allowed him to finish his outburst, her expression calm, almost amused. When he stopped, expecting her to stumble, she smiled lightly. "Senator," she said evenly, "if you're going to waive papers, at least make sure they support your claim. Because the very document you're holding, page 14, paragraph 2, says exactly what I just stated." The chamber erupted with murmurs, several senators turning their heads to glance at the document Kennedy clutched. He froze, realizing that she had not only anticipated his move but knew the evidence better than he did. Kennedy tried to speak again, but the room's energy had shifted. Harris pressed on, her words slicing through the noise. "Interruptions don't erase the truth, Senator. They just highlight the weakness of the argument." The silence that followed was deafening. Kennedy had been silenced not by force, but by precision. Kennedy's jaw tightened as he shuffled the papers in front of him, clearly stung by Harris's sharp rebuttal. He leaned toward the microphone once more, trying to regain control. "Madam Vice President," he snapped, "you're avoiding the central issue." But Harris didn't allow the bait to work. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm, cutting through his words without raising her tone. "I am not avoiding anything, Senator. I am addressing exactly what you refuse to acknowledge. And if you would stop interrupting for just one moment, everyone could hear the full answer you keep demanding." A ripple of laughter spread through the gallery. Even a few senators covered their mouths to hide their grins. Kennedy's face flushed deeper as he tried to speak again, but Harris raised a hand gently, not in defiance, but in complete control. "6 times now," she said, her voice steady. "6 times you've interrupted. But facts don't disappear just because you shout over them." The room fell silent. Kennedy, visibly frustrated, leaned back in his chair, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Harris turned to the rest of the chamber, continuing her argument as if nothing had happened. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of the standoff. Kennedy tapped his pen against the desk, his impatience obvious. He had interrupted 6 times, yet somehow it was Harris who now commanded the room. "Senator," Harris said, locking eyes with him, "if your strategy is to silence me, you've already failed. But if your goal is to debate, then allow me to finish my answer." Her tone was calm but laced with authority. The audience in the gallery leaned forward, sensing a decisive moment approaching. Kennedy inhaled, gripping his microphone, ready to unleash a 7th interruption. But this time, Harris was ready. She paused mid-sentence, then leaned closer, her eyes unwavering. "Go ahead, Senator," she said quietly. "Make it 7. And watch what happens next." The chamber froze. Kennedy hesitated, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a challenge he couldn't ignore. For the first time, it was clear, Harris had flipped the momentum. Kennedy couldn't resist. His pride demanded one more strike. He leaned in, his voice raised, cutting Harris off mid-thought. "That's exactly the problem with your argument," he shouted, slamming his palm against the desk. "You twist words, but you never give straight answers." The chamber stirred with gasps and murmurs. This was the 7th time, and everyone knew Harris had promised a response. Slowly, she sat back in her chair, letting the silence stretch. Kennedy expected her to fire back in anger, but instead she smiled, controlled, confident. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost surgical. "Senator," Harris began, "7 interruptions don't make your point stronger. They only prove you fear the answer." The gallery erupted with a wave of applause before being hushed. Kennedy froze, his face betraying both shock and frustration. Harris leaned forward once more, her tone sharp but calm. "And here's the straight answer you keep demanding: the facts are public, they're undeniable, and no amount of shouting will erase them." The silence that followed was crushing. Kennedy's shoulders slumped as Harris pressed forward, seizing the floor once and for all. The chamber buzzed like a courtroom after a decisive verdict. Senators exchanged glances, some nodding, others smirking at Kennedy's misstep. The gallery, though instructed to stay silent, couldn't contain small bursts of applause and whispers. Outside the chamber, clips of the exchange were already being posted online. On social media, Harris's final line replayed over and over, with captions like, "She shut him down instantly," and *7 strikes, Kennedy is out. Inside, Kennedy tried to compose himself. He shuffled his notes, pretending to search for something, but the damage was visible. Harris continued speaking with calm authority, her words uninterrupted for the first time that evening. "Public service requires patience and respect," she said firmly, glancing at Kennedy without naming him. "And if we can't even allow each other to finish a sentence, how can we expect the American people to trust us with finishing the job they elected us to do?" That line struck harder than any statistic. The chamber went silent, every senator and staffer taking in the weight of her words. Kennedy, who had spent the night trying to silence Harris, now found himself without a single word. By the time the hearing adjourned, headlines were already flooding the news cycle. "Harris silences Kennedy after seventh interruption," blared across television screens. Clips of the exchange topped trending lists on every platform, drawing millions of views within hours. Commentators replayed the moment frame by frame, analyzing Harris's composure and Kennedy's unraveling frustration. One anchor summed it up bluntly: "He came to dominate, but she came prepared. And preparation always wins." Meanwhile, ordinary viewers took to social media in droves. Memes, reaction videos, and hashtags painted Harris as the clear victor. Some even tallied the interruptions like a scoreboard: Kennedy, 0, Harris, 7. Back in her office, Harris remained calm, sipping tea as staff updated her on the viral storm. She simply smiled and said, "The facts speak louder than interruptions. Let the people judge for themselves." Kennedy, however, avoided the cameras. His aides hustled him past reporters, refusing to answer questions about the confrontation. For a man known for his wit and confidence, his silence spoke volumes. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of the confrontation spread through Washington like wildfire. Senators who had once kept their distance from Harris now praised her openly in interviews, citing her poise under relentless pressure. Behind closed doors, aides whispered about Kennedy's miscalculation. Some admitted privately that his constant interruptions had backfired, making him look unprepared and impatient, while Harris gained credibility as the voice of discipline and control. Editorials poured in from major newspapers. One headline read, "Harris turns interruptions into ammunition." Another went further, "Kennedy tried to silence her, but Harris spoke for the nation." Inside political circles, the debate was clear: Harris had scored a major victory, not just for herself, but for the image of calm, collected leadership. Kennedy's allies scrambled to spin the story, but every attempt only seemed to draw more attention to his visible frustration. For Harris, the moment was more than a viral clip, it was proof that her strategy of patience and precision could dismantle even the loudest opposition. The moment didn't stay contained within the United States. International outlets quickly picked up the story, running headlines that echoed the same theme: Kamala Harris outlasts interruptions, delivers decisive blow. In Europe, commentators praised her composure, contrasting it with the chaos often seen in parliamentary debates. "This was not just political theater," one analyst said on British television. "It was a masterclass in discipline under fire." In Asia, news clips of the exchange circulated on primetime broadcasts. Many highlighted Harris's sharp line, "7 interruptions don't make your point stronger. They only prove you fear the answer." The phrase was translated into multiple languages and quickly turned into a rallying quote online. Even in countries where U.S. politics usually drew little attention, the video sparked conversation. The image of a leader calmly dismantling loud opposition resonated universally. For Harris, this meant her influence was no longer just national, it had crossed borders. For Kennedy, it meant his miscalculated strategy had embarrassed him not just at home, but on the world stage. Inside the Senate halls, whispers about Kennedy's reputation grew louder. Colleagues who once admired his sharp tongue now questioned his judgment. Some quietly remarked that his eagerness to dominate had exposed a weakness, an inability to listen. Staffers who had been in the chamber the night of the clash admitted that Harris's calmness had impressed even her critics. One aide confided, "She didn't just beat him on policy, she beat him on composure. And in politics, that's everything." Kennedy's allies tried to rally support, but the more they defended him, the more replayed clips of the interruptions appeared on news programs. Each replay only reminded the public of how flustered he had become. Meanwhile, Harris's colleagues congratulated her in private, some even jokingly keeping a tally board of Kennedy's interruptions pinned to their offices. The number 7 had suddenly become a symbol of his misstep, and her triumph. What was once just another heated exchange in Washington had transformed into a turning point. Kennedy's image had taken a hit, while Harris's standing among her peers had risen sharply. That evening, back in her office, Harris sat with her closest advisors. The atmosphere was lighter than usual, laughter breaking out every time someone replayed Kennedy's 7th interruption. One aide grinned, "You know, that one line about fearing the answer, it's already on t-shirts online." The room erupted in laughter. Harris, however, didn't let the moment get to her head. She set down her tea and said calmly, "This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about showing people that respect matters. If I can keep composure after 7 interruptions, maybe the public will remember that leadership isn't about volume, it's about clarity." Her team nodded, impressed by her perspective. They understood she saw the bigger picture. The viral moment was more than a headline, it was an example of discipline in the face of chaos. Still, she couldn't ignore the symbolism. 7 times, she repeated with a quiet smile. "He thought it would break me. Instead, it made me stronger." The team left the office that night with a sense of momentum, knowing this confrontation had elevated Harris not just in the chamber, but in the eyes of the nation. Within a week, the confrontation had become a cornerstone of public discussion. At town halls and community events, people quoted Harris's line as if it were a campaign slogan, "7 interruptions don't make your point stronger." Late-night shows replayed the moment with comedic reenactments, while political analysts dissected it as a turning point in Harris's image. For many viewers, it symbolized resilience in the face of constant pressure, something they admired in a leader. Kennedy, on the other hand, found himself the subject of uncomfortable questions at every public appearance. Reporters asked whether he regretted his behavior, but his vague responses only deepened the impression that he had been bested. Meanwhile, Harris leaned into the momentum, not by gloating, but by doubling down on her message of patience and clarity. In speeches, she reminded audiences, "If we can't listen to each other, we can't lead each other." Each time she said it, applause roared. The exchange had grown far beyond one chamber debate, it had become a defining narrative about leadership and respect. And Harris was firmly at the center of it. Weeks later, the confrontation was still echoing through political circles and public discourse. For Kennedy, it was a lingering shadow, one that replayed every time he stepped into an interview or faced a microphone. His 7th interruption, meant to silence Harris, had become the moment that silenced him instead. For Harris, the event had crystallized into a symbol of strength. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lost her composure. Instead, she had allowed patience and precision to carry her message. What could have been an ordinary exchange in the Senate chamber became a defining moment, one that people remembered as a masterclass in leadership. Clips of her response were still circulating online, her words etched into the public memory, "7 interruptions don't make your point stronger. They only prove you fear the answer." That single line had shifted the narrative, transforming a barrage of interruptions into her most powerful rebuttal. In the end, Kennedy had lost control not just of the chamber, but of the story. Harris had turned disruption into discipline, chaos into clarity, and in doing so, she left her mark on history. The cameras may have stopped rolling that night, but the impact of that exchange continued to grow, proof that sometimes, one calm voice is stronger than 1,000 interruptions.